Thank you all for joining the NCJAR, North Central Jersey Association of Realtors Diversity Committee, Understanding Diversity and Inclusion Biases. My name is Vonetta Hawkins. I am the co-chair of the Diversity Committee, and I welcome you all to our amazing session today. Guys, we have a phenomenal speaker. I know you're clapping in the background. I know it. We have a phenomenal speaker, Leotis Sanders, and Leotis is the chief of the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity Programs over at New Jersey Transit. And let me just tell you, just speaking with him over the course of this time as we prepared for this session, he is a wealth of information, and it is great information that's going to help you kind of tie what's happening in our world and in our country and in your day-to-day to the real estate industry, and to help you to elevate yourself and to continue to grow your business. So I'm super excited to have him here, super excited for this session. And I will take this time to thank NCJAR for allowing us to present these type of sessions. Thank you all for joining. This is well needed, this diversity committee, and all of our committee members, my subcommittee members, I adore you all. You all help us put this together. Wendy, my co-chair, is not here today, but she sends her love as well. So again, without further ado, Leo, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Vonetta, and good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Vonetta. Thank you to the Diversity Committee and all of you. It's a pleasure to be here for the Central New Jersey Association of Realtors to have this conversation about diversity. Forgive me for the air traffic controller get up. I know this is sometimes a bit distracting. It does, having given many presentations over Zoom, allow for you to have better sound to hear me and for me to better hear you. So I know it can be a bit distracting, the things we're dealing with in the modern age, right? But it is a pleasure to be here in this conversation with all of you to talk about understanding diversity and bias. I especially want to just shout out and thank Microaggressions, who is a colleague at New Jersey Transit, a friend, and instrumental in me being here today. And with that, I'm going to dive into the presentation, and during it, I will tell you a little bit about me and what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this presentation. As you can see, it's just as advertised. Understanding diversity, equity, inclusion, and bias. Really, the goal of this conversation is to kind of demystify a little bit of what these terms mean, how they apply to the work that we do in the day-to-day. And especially, of course, for this, I thought about it in the context of being a realtor and did a little bit of research to understand some of those dynamics, so that I can make this relevant to what you might experience. So we're going to spend probably about half hour, 40 minutes going through the presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But know that at various points, I may be asking for you to share information in the chat about things you're seeing, or your thoughts about what we're able to experience in the day-to-day when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some thoughts about you coming into this session to make it as interactive as possible. Vonetta and Crystal, I'm realizing as I'm looking at this that I'm going to be seeing the presentation, so I can't see the chat. So I might ask if you are able to, when I ask a question, if you could just let me know some of the responses in the chat. That way I can follow along with responses. Is that okay? Will that work?
Sounds like a game plan.
All right, let's get into it. A little bit about me. So I have 20 years of experience in the diversity and inclusion space. I know you could not tell. I look like a millennial, but actually, yeah, 20 years of experience in this space. 12 years of experience as a civil rights and diversity officer. So CRO, civil rights officer, CDO, chief diversity officer. In these roles, I'm the person who's accountable for making sure that our civil rights are managed when it comes to New Jersey Transit, as well as diversity. So that's something I've been doing for a little while as well. I have experience in the private and public sector. So prior to New Jersey Transit, I did work in the private sector and get to do diversity there. So my initiation into that conversation is really in the private sector. So I can speak to this in a couple of different domains. And my specialty, I would say, is in designing these initiatives, specifically instructional design. So I create courses around diversity and inclusion and teach them. Strategic business alignment. So how do we take DEI and match it to what we want our business outcomes to be? And within that, of course, course design and development. So programmatic development for programs that are going to go long term. I specialize in that as well. And important to know, this is a personal interest for me. So I'm personally passionate about this topic. As a professional, it's what I'm committed to for my career, and an academic, which just means that during my free time, I do nerd out reading stuff about diversity, equity, and inclusion just because I find it really interesting. What we're going to talk about today is a few different things. We're going to have an overview of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the business case for them. What I call demystification. A lot of these terms, we don't know what they mean. They seem to blend into a lot of different things. It's very emotionally charged, very politically charged right now. So just to sort of lay out flat what we're talking about, we'll spend a little bit of time in that area. And then second, just talking about the business case for realtors and how it's relevant to all of you. Then we're going to switch to connecting bias to microaggressions, which it may seem like that's a hard switch, but I think you'll be able to see the way that when we're talking about diversity, equity, and especially inclusion, bias comes up as an issue to manage, and then microaggressions, the major way in which those biases might manifest themselves. And then I'll leave you with some resources, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A, although again, I'm going to be asking you some questions, so be ready to respond, please, in the chat. So let's start with our overview. So defining diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to ask you my first question. When you hear those terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, based on what you know, what you've heard, what you've seen, what do you think we're going to be talking about? What kind of subject matter? What do those words mean to you? Just free flow, put them all in the chat, please.
Nothing coming in yet, but it's okay. Oh, best practices.
Okay.
Best practices, race. Love it.
Let me see. Can I pull this up? Okay, I can see. Okay, good. I can see it. Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah, so best practices, race, racism, prejudice.
Yep. Think about that a lot. Speaking languages. Okay, very good. Thinking about others. I like that.
Yeah.
Definitely. Gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, cultures. Okay, great. Yeah. And these are a lot of the answers that we see. Certainly race, gender, sexuality. Many of the things that we're thinking about, acceptance, I saw there, many of these things do come up in conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I just want to introduce you to the model for how to get into the first part of this conversation, which is really diversity. And when we're talking about diversity, we're really talking about this. This is something many of you may have seen before. It is about 20 years old. It still is relevant and taught today. It is the diversity wheel. And this is a way in which we represent and talk about what we are talking about diversity. So people can really get a clear idea of just what comes into this conversation. So let's begin understanding this, this model. In the core there we have personality, and personality is really the core of who we are, and it's the core of diversity because it's a mix of nature and nurture, how you're born and the circumstances in which you are born into. So it is the one thing you absolutely cannot share with anybody else. You may have the same race as somebody else, you may be from the same places, be the same age, have the same birthday. You will never have the exact same personality, right? Because your circumstances will always be different. So that's the core of diversity. You move from there into the internal dimensions. And the internal dimensions are things that are intrinsic to who we are. These are things about us that are fixed and cannot be changed. You know, if you look at these are things that kind of are innate. Your physical ability may be one way, it may change to be another way. But once it changes, if it's really something about your ability, not an injury, but ability, you can't really change that back readily if you want to. We know we can't, excuse me, we know we can't turn the clock back on age as much as we might like to. When it comes to gender, people may say, well, what about, transgender and those kinds of things? And, your gender identity is fixed. So even in that conversation, being trans is not a matter of changing your gender so much as it is making your presentation fit the identity that you have, right? So these are things about us that are fixed, and they tend to be the things that people think about when they think about diversity. And that's, of course, because these are the things that are the most politically charged. They are the most legally, socially charged. And a lot of them are the things that we at least think we can know by looking at someone. So a lot of the issues that arise when we talk about bias have to do with these internal dimensions, but not only these internal dimensions. So let's consider the external dimensions. The external dimensions are the things about us that readily change over time. They're things we may share with a lot of different people, right? Because they're such broad categories, but they do matter in terms of who we are. Things like where we're born, where we live, whether or not we are parents, whether or not we're married, how much income we have, and also where that income comes from, our religion and spirituality, as was mentioned, our educational background. So these are things that also matter when it comes to who we are and our identity, but there are things that are immutable. They may change over time. And then we have the organizational dimensions, which is really who we are at work and our public life. And these are things that readily change over time, like where we work or our seniority, right? These things that'll change almost if we do nothing. But all of these are what we consider when we consider diversity. And so the first thing to understand when we're talking about diversity is that this is a conversation that includes everyone. Diversity often is portrayed as talking about these people with those particular sets of concerns. Sometimes we talk about diverse neighborhoods or diverse candidates in a way that's really not being true to what diversity is, because if you look, there's no specific group here. The category is not Black and Indigenous people or brown people, it's race, right? The category is not LGBTQ, it's gender, right? It's sexual orientation. So this is an inclusive conversation. No matter who you are, you have a race and a gender identity and a sexual orientation. So when we're using that language, one of the first things I'd like to share with you is that if you're talking about diversity, be specific. If you mean to say racial diversity, then you're talking about people of different races. If you mean to say someone who's Black or someone who's Latino or Latinx, if you prefer, then say Latino or Latinx or Black. Don't use the euphemism diverse. It kind of waters down the conversation, and it's what kind of gets confused when we're talking about diversity. So this is a conversation that is relevant and inclusive to everyone. So when we're talking about what is diversity, the first thing to understand is we're talking about the range of group and individual characteristics, identities, and cultures that make up and inform who we are and how we interact with each other. So I like that comment about thinking about others. It is literally, yes, thinking about everything that goes in to who they are and who we are and what that means for our interaction. It represents the full spectrum of these differences and similarities that can be found in human beings. And it includes the intrinsic, the extrinsic, and the organizational dimensions of who we are, as well as personality. For those of you that may be familiar with the Myers-Briggs is a personality inventory. That is diversity in the personality dimension, right? So diversity encompasses all these topics. Now you may say, Leo, I hear you, but when I hear diversity talked about in the news, it doesn't seem to me they're talking about everybody, right? It seems to me they're talking about particular groups, particular issues, histories with particular cultural relevance to them. Right now, there's all of this conversation about critical race theory, right? And that seems to be in the background of diversity. The last administration was trying to say that you couldn't do diversity training. So it seems like it's not everybody. It seems like it's a very specific conversation. And the reason for that takes us to our next word to define, which is equity. You see, while we have that vast array of differences that encompasses all of us, the fact is we have not all had the same experience being in this country. We don't all have the same experience today. The histories of discrimination, of segregation, of racism, sexism, homophobia impact the way that different groups have experienced living in this country, being at work, looking for a home. And so when we're talking about diversity, we can't talk about it in a way that just says everybody's the same, because everyone does not have the same experiences, right? So we could say that everybody fits in diversity. But when you're talking about fairness and equity, you move into a different space of what you have to consider. So equity is talking about promoting and ensuring fairness and impartiality. Among all of this diversity, equity looks at how do you make sure with all of this difference, people are treated fairly. They're treated impartially. It requires having processes and procedures to ensure there is consistency in how folks are treated. You have to think about, especially in the work that you do, what are you going to do to safeguard to make sure that everyone who comes in has the same experience? How do you make sure that they perceive and know that there is fairness in your interactions? And it centers justice and support for historically marginalized and underrepresented groups. I think this is really important when it comes to equity, because a lot of the common notion of fairness is this really sort of basic idea that, everybody should be treated the exact same. So, if somebody just ran a marathon and somebody just came out of a spa and they both asked me for the cup of water that I have as the concierge, and I only have one bottle left, I should pour the water in 2 glasses and give it to them equally, right? Because that's being fair. But of course, that's not being fair. This person who just ran the marathon probably has a greater need. It would work to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to give you this bottle. Person, just wait for a moment. I'm going to go back, get some more, and I'll come back to you, right? I think that at a human level, we would understand, yeah, that would be the thing. The person even from the spot be like, yeah, give them the water. I can hang out for a second. It's fine, right? So we want to have a more complicated understanding of what fairness and equity means. And so that means centering those groups that historically have been disadvantaged and marginalized. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about this, but I just wanted to give you just the theory of what equity is and why it's important to the conversation about diversity. Because if you have diversity without equity, you have the chance to reproduce the same kind of discrimination people have experienced in the past. Once you have diversity and you have equity, okay, it's fair and impartial, that's not enough to really get us to an experience that people want to do business with us or feel like they're comfortable in the environment that they're in. This is where inclusion becomes important. Inclusion is active involvement and empowerment of all individuals, groups, and cultures that cultivates an experience of belonging and community. So we may have a business that says we're fair, we're going to treat everyone fairly, but when someone walks in the door, they may get looks, right? They may have a certain experience in our interaction with them, right? People can tell a fake smile. So they don't have that experience of being welcome, right? We've probably all had the experience of being in a space and feeling like being in a space and feeling like you don't belong there, right? Like I shouldn't be here. Clearly, like these folks don't really want me to participate, right? They're not really interested in me being there. It refers to cultural and environmental feeling of being seen and welcomed exactly as you are and exactly as you aren't. So when you are looking to create inclusion, you want to normalize people being however they are. Now, this can be a challenge, right? Depending on what we're comfortable with and familiar with, which is why the conversation about bias you could see being relevant here. Because if we have biases, that's going to be our opportunity to make people feel excluded. And it can be assessed as the extent to which people experience being valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate in an organization and process. So look at those words again, which people experience, not perceive, but experience being valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate. So think about the processes that you are all responsible for and check in. Do you consciously make sure that no matter who walks in the door, they experience being valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate in the process? When you are doing that, you are actively cultivating inclusion. So that's DEI in a nutshell. Now, there's whole courses you could spend going into what each of these mean, and they're out there. So that's like a 10-minute summary. But I want to pause in case anybody has any questions or comments about what you've heard so far. Let's take a moment just to check in to see if all that landed.
The question that had come in earlier was, oh, it was just, did you work for this Division of Civil Rights in New Jersey? No, you worked for New Jersey Transit.
Got it. No, yeah, we have interaction with DCR, but I do not work for them. A lot of us doing this here in the state.
Love it. Love it.
All right, let's rock on. So the business case for diversity. So now that we know what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, we have the question, all right, so how does this matter at work? Right, especially back in the day, not so much now. People used to ask, why? This seems like social stuff. Why do we deal with it here? Mainly because it's now a business conversation. The changes in the demographics in terms of distributions of talent, employment options, and wealth have created pressures that drive DEI in these domains, the workforce, the workplace, and the marketplace. So essentially, workforce isn't what it once was, right? 50, 60 years ago, talent all looked a certain way because only certain people had access to education and the resources to promote themselves professionally. The workforce looks a lot different now. Talent is not only diverse in terms of racial representation and gender representation, but age, ability, and even nationality, right? Because now we're in a global workplace. So when it comes to workforce, really, we have a need to make sure that we're sensitive to the needs of a wide range of diversity in all dimensions so that our employees feel empowered and they want to come and work with us. So organizations now have to be competent when it comes to DEI because of the workforce shifts. When it comes to the workplace, we know very readily, me talking to you right now is a result of how the workplace is changing, right? Our ability to flex with the introduction of technology, the wants and needs of different generations in terms of what their work experience is. Our ability to flex work are all things that require we become competent in DEI. One of the major ways this has shown up is that when we went remote and it was all work from home, well, there's a wide range of people who have the ability to equip themselves to work from home, right? Depending on their income, their economic circumstances, their parental status, their marital status. They may not be able to flex this and manage with having children, right? Or other circumstances that may inhibit their ability to do everything that they would do if they're in the office. Their access to technology varies. They just may not have good internet where they are. All of these things impact the workplace. That's a real-time example, but these kinds of shifts have been happening for a while. You could think about outsourcing of jobs overseas and needing to have an organization that is perhaps based in the US, but has people in Hong Kong or in Spain or in India who are doing work directly tied to the business. And how do you integrate to make one community organization? How do you create inclusion in that circumstance? And then finally, the marketplace, right? The wealth distribution has changed. More people have money to spend. More people are able to go out and buy homes that weren't able to buy homes. So before I go to the next slide, I just want to ask you, what are all or some of the ways in which you think this conversation is relevant to you as realtors? You could just put them in the chat. Like, why do you think as realtors, this is something that you'd want to pay attention to?
They're thinking diligently.
I know, exactly. It was like, I didn't know I was going to have to do anything this morning. We help people.
All right, there we go.
We need to make sure that we're properly doing that. Very good. Yes. Yes, competition for homes is intense. Very good. Cannot assume that immigrants who may not be able to speak English are not qualified to purchase a home. Brilliant. That is absolutely one of the things you want to take away, right, in terms of how biases can creep in, how we think about different populations. Really wonderful. Can I just get, I neglected to put a timer in front of me. Vonetta, how am I doing on time?
You're good. It's 10. We're at 10:26.
Excellent. Okay, great. We are on track. Well, some of this thinking has been done for us by the National Association of Realtors in terms of what's the business case for diversity for realtors. And they are some of the things that you all just mentioned here. So tomorrow's association is diverse. So they're thinking about the future of the organization. And by the way, this is something that was created in 2008. I looked at it. It's a pretty broad document. It's still pretty good. I think that a lot of that information is still directly applicable today. They talk about capturing emerging markets, increasing membership, and breaking barriers to sales, right? So DEI, being competent, needs to happen in order to understand how we're going to position ourselves to take advantage of these new markets. They talked about combining strategies to create synergy, which requires creating an experience of inclusion. They talk about strengthening community influence, promoting minority home ownership, gaining access to information, and improving professional image. Again, you can kind of hear this is sort of the marketplace things that organizations are doing, right? When it comes to how you want to position your organization, a huge amount of attention is paid to reputation management, right? You can see the sensitivity to brands and who they align themselves with and how they're portrayed in the media. The whole kick up, no matter what side of the issue you are, but about cancel culture and people coming at you as an organization if you do something or employ people or take actions that they see as counter to the interests of promoting DEI. So that's a sensitive place, right? Our professional image, who we are perceived to be by the public. And then, of course, racial and ethnic diversity is the hallmark of today's real estate market, the growth of minority buying power. And there it is, right? The wealth distribution has changed. And so this is what makes this a business relevant conversation. Again, I think this is important because sometimes folks look at this as a social conversation. And yeah, I think sociologically, a lot of people's values or thoughts may align with DEI. I know mine do, but others may not. This is what makes it a relevant conversation for everyone who is engaged in business today. So let's connect this to microaggressions through looking at the lens of bias, which again, is not going to be so hard a shift as it may seem. Bias is at its core a tendency, trend, inclination, feeling toward or against something or someone else, especially one that is preconceived or unreasoned. So anytime you have a thought about something where you haven't really given the chance to reason it out and think it through, that's just a bias that you have. These are not good or bad. As you can see, they can be toward or against something, but they do impact the way we interact with others. I often come to work and work with our human resources department when it comes to recruitment and talking about bias when it comes to recruitment. And one of the things that we believe as an organization when it comes to who runs our railroad is that people from the military are really good for our railroad because we run our railroad kind of like a military organization. We look for precision, efficiency, right? There's very clear roles and responsibilities, even some of the nomenclature mirrors the military. So they would say, you're a veteran, you're good for railroad. And I would say, that's an interesting bias. And when I first said that, they was like, what? What are you talking about? Like, we clearly, this is good. We know veterans have this discipline. I'm like, I'm sure some veterans do, but I'm sure some people who were not in the military have those same kinds of abilities. And you're saying that somehow veterans have it innately and only, right? As opposed to looking at who has the qualifications. And by the way, there's some veterans that don't, right? There's some people who put themselves in the military, and even though they served, they never really adopted and internalized a lot of the things you think you're going to get. Doesn't make them bad people, doesn't even make them bad soldiers necessarily, but doesn't mean they bring the qualities that you think they're going to bring by dint of being a veteran. And I put that example up because we always have to check ourselves and our biases, no matter what we're thinking, even if we think, I like this group of people, and I don't even reason it, I don't question it, I just like them. We just want to know that's a bias. Here's some things about bias we want to understand. As I just said, the scientific consensus is that we all have them. They are innate to our design as human beings, and they're not innately good or evil, right? So you don't have to judge them. If someone says you have a bias, or you're being biased, it's just something to look at because it may be, a positive bias. You're being pulled towards something. But certainly that word has become very charged today. Important to know it's not innately evil. They can be harmful when they're unseen and unmanaged. So this is the thing, whether it comes to hiring someone or it comes to how you engage in the work that you all do in real estate. This is something that can damage people's opportunity. It can certainly impact their experience of belonging or being properly served or engaged with. And so that's when we really want to be responsible for it. We want to make sure that we are seeing and managing our biases as much as we can. They can be explicit, right? So someone may actually say, I don't think immigrants are as good as homeowners, or they're as good as prospects as other people, or they may be implicit. No one may say that, but it may just be something that they think, right? It just be like they may pull from some sort of vague opinion that they have about it. Important to know that biases are inherent and you can't get rid of them. So here's the thing. There's a lot of talk about, anti-bias training failing and it doesn't work. And I would agree with a lot of that, because the initial run at anti-bias training was designed to take biases out. And that's how it was portrayed. We can help you get rid of biases. Scientific consensus is that you cannot do that. What you can do is manage them. So before we get to how you might manage your biases, let's talk about some of the biases you might encounter. We're very close to actually being complete and being able to take a lot of your questions. So going back a step, when you think about bias and you hear it in the media, you may hear a lot about racial bias or gender bias. And certainly they mean having animus or preferences regarding those groups. But the fact of the matter is those biases ride on top of other basic biases that all human beings have. And so I want to go through a few of the critical ones that are relevant, especially when it comes to a sales environment, and for you as realtors to be aware of. And so you can just check in to see if these are some things that resonate with you. So primacy biases talk about your originating experiences, your first experiences with something, your prime experiences with something, something that had the biggest sort of formative first impact on you. So you might think about, if you have different groups that you feel more or less comfortable with, what was your first experiences with that group, right? If someone walks in the door and you have a response to them, think about, well, how might my first experience with someone who looks like this or is from this group or represents themselves in this way might have been, right? Because that has a big impact on your thinking. Same with recency biases. Recency biases are similar, except they're recent experiences. So you may have just had an interaction with someone who wasn't able to purchase a home or wasn't able to get themselves together and organized to be able to get access to resources and made it very difficult. And then someone may come right behind them and be from that same community, right? And so there might be now a recency bias there, something that's informing your thoughts, right, about this person because you just had an experience. Horns and halos, you might have heard. This is over magnification of qualities based on impression and preferences. Now, this is interesting because to some degree in sales, we're trained to kind of amplify things you have in common with someone, right? You try to find things you like. Oh, you went to that school? I went to that school. Oh, you know that person? I know that. You watch that show? I watch that show. So the psychological mechanism that has that work is unfortunately, or just something to be aware of, not even unfortunate, but curiously, a bias mechanism, because we tend to over magnify qualities based on impressions. If someone has something that we associate with that we think is really great to have, that becomes a halo effect, right? We then magnify that to overshadow other qualities. You could also apply this to work if somebody did a really good job at something. If someone made a huge sale or made a big difference, we then tend to magnify that positive quality in a way that imbalances our view of them with their other qualities in mind. Horns works the opposite way. You can imagine that's the negative influence, right? Somebody does something that's negative, they have a quality that's negative, that may overshadow everything else, right? Someone walks in, they have a big bank account, but they're dressed shabbily. To what degree does that impact our thoughts on whether or not this is someone we want to interact with? Right? So this is something that goes on commonly. We do it all the time as human beings. Confirmation bias, our preconceived beliefs, right? So if I think someone from a certain community is not able to get a home, even if I say, all right, I'm going to give this person a shot, what's going to go on in the back of my mind is that I'm going to be looking for evidence that I'm right. And so the moment they say, well, that's a concern, we might have this issue, our brain inside is going to go, aha, see, I knew it, right? And it will shift the way that we interact with that person. So if we have a preconceived belief about anyone in any kind of way, it's going to shape the way that we interact with them, because we're not interacting with them as if they're a blank slate. We're looking to gather evidence to support what we already think. Mirror effect. Now, this is related to the example I was giving for horns and halos, right? About trying to find things that are similar. The mirror effect says that we will have a bias towards what we have affinity for or what is similar to us. The more we relate to someone, we're going to feel more biased toward them, more sympathetic. This is just a human thing. There's actually even some thoughts in neurology that this may even just be a brain thing, right? A mirror neurons, like we just are wired to, if we see ourselves being reflected in some way, like it, right? It's the narcissist effect, if you want to think about it in that sense. So again, that effort to kind of make ourselves seem similar to a client or to relate to them also is something that works at a bias level, because the same is going to be true if we see someone who we see as dissimilar to us, right? If someone walks in and we don't relate to that person, they're not from a community or from a background that we have a close association with, we're going to instantly distance ourselves. Contrast, comparison, you can imagine this one right away, right? You have two different clients and comparing them to one another, right? Or different individuals who are members of the association, different people who we might encounter just in our day-to-day, right? Just always saying, is this person like that person? Are they a member of the group? Are they not a member of the group? Now, we as human beings, do this all the time to try to figure out people. Is a game that people play. What's that person's story? What are they like? Are they like this or are they like that? Do they like these things or those things? That is a human game that we play. Our minds want us to do that. But you need to know that the purposes of doing that is sorting out bias, right? Are you similar to me or are you not similar to me? Are you someone who I have comfort with or someone who I have less comfort with? That is why that is so important to us, is because our brain wants to make those associations. And then finally, effective heuristics or the beauty bias, which you may have heard about, most CEOs are men over 6 feet tall, right? Like that kind of thing. Whatever we perceive as beautiful, as aesthetic, as something to which we aspire, we associate positive qualities with. It is just a fact of how we are designed. Doesn't mean that everybody has the same beauty standards. It does mean whatever you find to be beautiful or very attractive to you, you're going to be biased toward. So these are some of the key biases that inform and impact people's experiences. And you can imagine that this directly can link to someone's experiences when it comes to looking for a home and how much they feel like they belong or are welcome when it comes to receiving service. This gets us to our conversation about microaggressions. So microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults. This is important, whether they are intentional or unintentional. So it doesn't mean that we're consciously being mean. Again, we talked about some of these being unconscious, right? It doesn't mean that we're intending harm, but people will feel slighted. They can communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So them being a part of a marginalized group or a minority group, or in our day-to-day case, someone who we're just not familiar with, can really impact them in a way that is negative. So microaggressions can be conscious, stereotypes, right? Saying, and that was such a great example in the chat, someone from an immigrant community can't afford to be a homeowner, right? Like that's a stereotype. Someone may consciously say that, or they may be sarcastic in their humor, right? Yeah, right, that person's gonna do business with us, right? Those are microaggressions that are conscious, right? We know that like we have a bias there, but they're often the result of unconscious bias. They're just something that's out of our view. They can be linked to declines in sales, performance, productivity, perceptions of a healthy working environment and good customer service. So these slights matter. People notice them and they absolutely impact inclusion. Becoming aware of and managing your stereotypes and unconscious biases is key to reducing microaggressions. And so as we get close to wrapping here and I can take some questions, what are some approaches to managing microaggressions, really looking at these unconscious biases specifically? Well, for one, you want to recognize your unconscious bias. One resource I'm going to give you is the implicit association test, just a way for you to get a sense of some biases you may have. Challenge your stereotypes and assumptions. So when you find yourself saying you believe something, challenge like, okay, but what's my real evidence for that? Like maybe, let me just check myself. Saw this presentation, this guy Leotis said, like, maybe I should take a look at that. Let me take a look at that. Do I have really good evidence for this? One of the things you can really do to actively transform your association is to begin challenging stereotypes and assumptions that seem to be common, right? One of the things that we talk about as we get into biases at a deeper level is that there are individual biases, and then there are group biases, and then institutional biases, right? There's systemic biases. You may think about it just the way people talk about systemic racism. There's systemic biases. There's stereotypes and assumptions built in to how we function. So you might start to look for any assumptions that you make as a group, as an institution, and then challenge, hey, do we have good evidence for that? I think this is a bias. We should take a look at this. Manage your eye contact. One of the major ways people report microaggressions is how much eye contact they get or don't get, and the way in which that eye contact happens. Looking somebody up and down, giving somebody side eye, averting your eyes when someone comes to talk to you. These are all things people notice. And there's actually a physiological response people have to it. So make sure if you're managing nothing else, you want to manage your eye contact consciously with people. Be careful with sarcasm and teasing forms of humor. We tend to use humor as a bridge to help us connect with another human being. It is common to use it to break the ice, like make an observation, right? Make a joke, get someone to laugh. You know, this is something that some folks feel very comfortable with, and they're very good at it. They have a very intuitive sense of where the boundaries are. They can get a good read on people. But sometimes even those folks don't get it right. And we're not all that good, right, at being able to determine whether or not someone is available for the joke that we want to make on any given day. So just be careful with it. I'm not someone that says, don't, can't say jokes. Jokes are inappropriate. I think humor is fine. I think I'm someone who likes to make jokes, but you just have to be careful. You've got to be mindful and you've got to be responsible, especially when it comes to any of those areas of diversity we talked about. When you look at that wheel, just know that people may strongly identify with any element on that wheel. And for them, they're going to be very sensitive to any joke made about it. Create ways to ensure everyone has a voice and can be heard. So as much as possible, solicit opinions from everyone. A lot of times this means making it comfortable for people to share their opinions, their thoughts, and feedback. You have to manage this in your environment. So sometimes it's about being anonymous. Sometimes it's about polling, making sure every single person has a chance to share what their thoughts and opinions are. But you want to make sure that you can get everyone's input, because the beauty about diversity is the more of it you have, the more you're able to respond to everyone's concerns. Check in on others' sense of inclusion. Ask for feedback. Now, I want to be very, very careful. This does not mean if it's a majority, say, white environment, you've got one Black person who's a member of the association, you go to that Black person and say, do you feel included? Is this good? Is this all working for you? That is not the thing that I'm saying, all right? Do not do that. There's lots of bad examples of people doing that. It does mean that you want to be sensitive to making sure you check in on inclusion for everyone. This can mean general conversations in which you check in to say, how are we doing as a team? What's everyone's experience? If you're thinking about doing things as an outing or as a group, make sure you're being sensitive to what everyone's thoughts are, what's going to be a fun activity. What's everybody's ability to participate in the activity? Ask, are we missing anything? If you're having a conversation as a group, say, who should be a part of this conversation who's not here? Who should we be asking the opinion of that we have not asked yet? These are ways to check in on others' sense of inclusion, right? And this is important for your business process because remember, that organizational dimension of diversity is as real as the others. And then finally, and most importantly, individuate. Strive to engage others as individuals rather than as members of the group. Be curious. Any new person that walks in your door is someone you've probably never met before. Whatever they look like, whatever you can see from what you can read, have a little bit of doubt about it. Be curious, investigate. check again your assumptions and engage with them as the individual or individuals as they are and proceed from there. That's always going to be a great way to help you make sure that you're keeping your biases at bay. Now, again, none of this is designed to be easy. This isn't turnkey. This requires practice, right? And none of these things are going to make biases go away. You're still going to have them at the end of the day. But the more you practice these, what will happen is your ability to manage your biases will strengthen. They will still have them. Those voices will still come up, but you'll be able to spot them and be responsible for them so they don't negatively impact your interactions with others. So finally, some resources for you to think about. And I can share this with Vonetta and the team so that they can send it all out to you. But you have there the National Associations of Realtors D&I roadmap that they created for you. Again, I read it through. I think it's a really great tool for you to be able to look at to understand how this organization was thinking about this quite a few years ago. But really is something that I think is directly applicable because the mission that they identify and what they think is important are still things that are at play today. The Harvard Implicit Association test I mentioned, that is a test that basically asks you to look at an image and see how quickly you respond to it to basically make associations. I'm not going to tell you more about that because I think it's something that it's good to experience, but it is insightful to get some ideas about biases you may not even know you have. And then finally, if you want more continuing education on managing bias, the University of California has a great Managing Implicit Bias series that they've made free that I think is brilliant and really takes you into more detail, and it's online, so you can access that right away and get some more education about this topic. That said, I'm looking forward to your questions. I know that's a ton of information coming at you very quick and a lot of speechifying at the end there, but important to make sure that you got all the information. I wanted to make sure that you got especially those key parts about managing bias. And the conversation just begins here. So please ask your questions and we can talk for a little bit before we complete.
Oh, this was awesome. So we do have a Gyro, who is our president. He put in the comments, NAR has created programs like Fair Haven and implicit bias training in which our members have free access to. We also talked about that in one of our other sessions. So he'd like to encourage all members to look out into the information and make sure that they take the Fair Haven simulation. So this was awesome. Thank you. While you guys are kind of thinking about whatever question you want to ask for Leo, for me, I think this was just phenomenal, Leo, and I definitely thank you. Some key things that I kind of pulled out of what you spoke about was being specific when you talk about diversity. A lot of people just throw that word out there, and no one, you don't know what you're talking. You could be talking about race, and I'm talking about gender. Right. I had a conversation recently, and someone said diversity, and they were talking about military status, and I'm like, oh, okay. So you never know what somebody's speaking about when they're talking about diversity. So be specific when you're mentioning diversity. I love the component the example that you gave when you talked about equity. Putting it in layman's term around that cup of water, who needs it? The person that just read the marathon, and making it so simple as that, so that when you're thinking about equity and who we should be, focusing on when it comes to that, just makes it really simple to kind of just put into context. And then recognizing your biases. We all have them. It's just what it is, and it's okay. It's okay, yes. But recognizing that you have them, if they could be negatively impacting people around you, is what you want to make sure you do. So I love that component of it. So let's see, what do we have here and here? Oh, Crystal put in the chat, everyone, the Fair Haven, the link for the Fair Haven. So definitely connect through that and make sure you take the class. It's awesome. Couldn't take note fast enough. It's okay. It's okay. I'm not sure, Leo, are we able to share this presentation or just the resources?
Sure. I will send you a PDF of the PowerPoint, and then you can distribute that if you would.
Okay. Awesome. Okay? Awesome. Listen, I love it. I love it. Guys, any questions out there, or Leo, any, I know we have a couple of minutes, but we can definitely close early if they don't have any questions. You gave them everything. You gave them a lot.
Well, I want to make sure everybody got value and had all of the basic questions answered. But of course, this is just the very beginning, right? This is very
Right.
cursory stuff, and you can go way deep in these topics. So questions are great.
Right. So I would say I agree 10,000%. This was a high level. What is DE&I? What is microaggressions? What is bias? And people, I would just encourage everyone to continue to learn. I try to be a better Vonetta every day. So I encourage everyone to always try to be better. We can always learn something new about someone. Seek and be intentional about learning. You know, that's one thing is sometimes we slip up and we happen to learn. But when it comes to DE&I, be intentional. So joining this class today was really part of your intentionality around wanting to learn more about DE&I. So I commend you all, but I would encourage you to keep on being intentional about your efforts and learning more about your biases and diversity, equity, and inclusion and microaggressions. The more you know, the better you are going to be able to position yourself when you're out there in the world and interacting and engaging with people every single day, especially in this real estate industry. So I'll close with that. Leo, do you have any maybe final remarks for our members?
I do see a question and some things in the chat. So just
okay, there we go. There we go.
If we have time to answer a question or two.
Look, let me say, okay, great presentation. They want to copy perfect. This was very thoughtful, got me thinking of things that I normally overlook. I love that, Erin, and that's key. So Erin said it got her thinking of things that she normally overlook. A lot of us do. This was great. Always learning. Thank you, Vonetta and Wendy. You're welcome. Sweetheart, y'all. So those were their comments, Leo. They were all, when you were asking other questions before, when you were going through the presentation before, they were all just putting out their just comments around the different things that they, even like some of the myths. We had a section on a session on Section 8, and someone put in the comments that there's a myth that Section 8 applicants automatically have bad credit and or bad clients, and it's a horrible myth. And just we'll do a plug, everybody, shameless plug. But the homeownership voucher program for Section 8, which is actually called the homeownership voucher program, they actually go through a credit and education class, and they have to have a 680 credit score in order to get the housing voucher program. So if you get someone that has a housing voucher program and is able to buy a home through that program, they have good credit. Hello.
There you go.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Information
Leo,
to challenge assumptions. Okay.
Exactly. So we will get it closed out. Any parting remarks for our members?
No, it was a pleasure. I would just say your words, Vanessa, I think, be curious, be open to everybody as an individual, and just know that this is a journey and we're all still on it. So we continue to learn things about DEI every day. And hopefully this gives you a different lens with which to look at what you see or hear about in the news or at work every day. And it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. We thank you as well. You're definitely a professional. We see why you are chief, because you are definitely in charge.
Well, thank you.
I love it. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous day.
All right. Take care.